Greetings. This is Rev Yearwood. I am the chair of the Green 2.0 Board of Directors, and I'm so glad that you are able to join us. Today, I have exciting news that I wanted to bring to you. We are in a critical time, as you know, and DEI is under attack, as well as the climate movement in general. And so it is time for us to figure out what we must do to ensure that we as a planet and we as a movement transition together. So we at Green 2.0 are so pleased to announce that we actually have a new managing director, not new to us, someone who's been here, but just someone who we believe is ready for this moment to lead us. And that is none other than Adrienne Alicia. She's a phenomenal person. And she is important because what we have, and for me personally, what we need in this movement is a movement that allows us to do the work that we say we need to do. And part of that is having a strong matriarchal, people of color, women of color, young person, and queer-led movement. And throughout this climate movement, that is how we win. That is how we transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And so we at Green 2.0 see the need to transition ourselves, and there's no one else besides Adrienne to lead us. And so I'm excited that we now have someone who can speak and be about and have the passion of the movement, exactly what we want to see in other organizations, a matriarchal, young person, queer-led, people of color-led, woman-led, this diverse movement of inclusion and equity. That's what we need right now. So we have much work to do. We're under attack, but right now, enjoy this session, get wisdom, get educated, and get powerful as we lead our world to a much more sustainable future. And with that, I bring on our new leader, our champion, our managing director, Adrienne.
Thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood, for that really generous introduction. Green 2.0 staff is so appreciative of your leadership through the years, and I'm really personally excited to just get to work with you. So good afternoon to everyone. As Rev Yearwood said, I'm Adrienne Alicia. I'm the Managing Director at Green 2.0, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our event today, Protecting Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in 2024. We are experiencing a paradigm shift in DEIJ and in the environmental space. But what I want to say is that environmental organizations are still holding strong to their values. So this group of people who are working to undo all of the meaningful progress we've made, they're not going to win. And what they're doing isn't unique. We're seeing history repeat itself. We live in a nation where after progress in social or racial justice has been made, there's a concentrated effort to take us back. But we're not going back. That's just not happening. It's not happening today. It's not happening under the leadership and partnership of all the organizations working on DEIJ throughout the climate movement. So this panel here today is gathered to discuss why and how investment in DEIJ and in racial justice is more important than ever. We're going to explore how, as advocates and leaders, we can actually use this moment to strengthen our commitment to equity and justice, even with this attack. I have a couple of housekeeping items before we start that I want to note. We are live captioning today's event. If you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the Q&A box. We always try our best to get to every one of your questions. It doesn't always happen, but we will keep a log of all the questions and follow up with you afterwards if we run out of time. And you will receive, this is like the most asked question every webinar, you will receive an email tomorrow with a recording of the webinar and with some other resources as well. And before we begin, I just want to thank all of our panelists, our partners, and a huge thank you, as always, to our program associate, Juliana Ojeda, for everything she pours into all of our events, and today's in particular. I now have the pleasure of passing it over to our moderator, Ivalis. Take it away. I'm excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here with such esteemed panelists. As mentioned, my name is Ivalis Crespo. I use they, them pronouns. And I have been a workplace equity advocate for over 10 years, first as a civil rights and employment discrimination lawyer, and now as a DEI practitioner. Now, before I ask the panelists that I have the privilege of having join me today to introduce themselves, I'd like to highlight that the comments, the statements, and the points raised here today are the individual views of the presenters and not the views of the organization they represent. I feel like that is a great disclaimer. And with that said, I'd like to now ask our panelists to go ahead and turn on their cameras, introduce themselves. I'd like to know their pronouns, where they work, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our questions for today. We can go ahead and start with Leslie.
Sure. Thank you, Evelise. Leslie Hingston, she, her pronouns, and I'm Chief Officer for Racial Justice and Equity at the League of Conservation Voters. And should we just popcorn it? David.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hinkson.
Yeah, thank you. David, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Glasgow. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging, which is a research center affiliated with the NYU School of Law. And then I'll throw to Robin.
Thank you, David. Hello, I'm Robin Arville, she, her, Aya, Chief People and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Officer at the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC.
Well, thank you so much all for those introductions. I'd like to go ahead and get started now. This question is for all our panelists, and we'll go ahead and start with Robin and then popcorn around. Robin, in your opinion, what are the most pressing current challenges facing diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice initiatives today?
I can think of about three. First is lack of funding. I believe we have a opportunity and necessity to weave DEI into the fabric of our organization. And we need to drop the notion that we can only do it with a very small siloed DEI budget. If we want systems change, then we've got a budget for it. I've shared this with my own organization. A budget is a moral document of the institution. If DEI is showing up as 0.0001% of our operating budget, then it demonstrates how our leadership, how our board, how the whole organization feels about DEI work. The second is relying on the wrong metrics. So we need to really directly tie everything we're doing to measurable outcomes. Otherwise, the most effective efforts are not really seen and shared. And that's all about really sharing it with the institution. We also see the patience and the slowness to change as a constant tension that we see. And we have to grapple with effective efforts really taking months and years to show results. You know, sometimes it's 20 steps forward, 50 steps back, but we have to, you know, keep going and keep committed. So those are the top that I can think of right now. Thank you.
Absolutely, great points, Robin. Leslie, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with everything Robin said. And I think maybe what I want to do is, I'll be the odd person out here, and I'm going to focus on internal threats, right? And I think that there are two, right? There are two that I can come up with now, especially based on the external threats that Robin has identified that I'm sure David's going to add to. You know, I feel as though organizations who have publicly come out and said that we are committed to racial justice and equity, DEIJ, JEDI, you know, choose your acronym, we're kind of under a microscope now, right? And so I think that, and I have seen improvement over time. I think that we actually have to be a little bit better at tying, right, these commitments to our actual mission and purpose, right? If people externally can't actually make sense of why we're doing this and how this isn't mission creep, right, then, you know, then that's it. There will be no more funding, right? There will be attacks on us legally, right? And so we need to really drill down on that and just keep getting better. And I think the second thing that I would say in terms of threats is is people both internally and external to our organization not really understanding that the work that we do requires expertise, right? Like, we are professionals, right? We are professionals. We are not just people, right, who look a certain way and use certain words, right? We actually have done research, are doing research, and have figured out how to take that research and apply it in ways that are specific to the needs of our organizations, right? And I think that, like, the sort of, and I'm not saying that this is something that is prevalent in organizations, but I do think that the more the people that we work with in particular understand that we are the experts at our organization in this, I think I think the more progress we can actually keep building upon in this work.
Absolutely, Dr. Hinkson. David, do you want to chime in, and do you have anything else you want to add?
Sure. So I love all the points that both Robin and Leslie have made. Just to kind of add, a few thoughts from, my vantage at a research center that focuses on the intersection of the law and DEI. Obviously right now we're facing a huge legal backlash against DEI ever since the Supreme Court decision last year on affirmative action in June. There has been an uptick in a lot of legal challenges to DEI programs, anti-DEI lawsuits, a lot of anti-DEI legal activity. So that's a massive threat or challenge in 2024. I think it also speaks to a broader cultural narrative attacking DEI. So these legal threats didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a lot of groundwork laid for them in the attacks on, so-called critical race theory in schools. That was obviously a massive issue in 2021 and 2022, and a broader kind of anti-DEI cultural narrative that's emerged and become pretty powerful in recent times. And then finally, I would sort of point to, I guess, what I would call almost like the quiet quitting of DEI, which is, I worry a lot about organizations that, I don't think many organizations want to say outwardly, like, we don't care about this anymore. But I think what we are seeing is, budget cuts or, little rollbacks here and there without publicly announcing it. And so I'm worried that we're going to see a challenge where organizations will continue to say that they're committed to this work, but whether or not they're actually backing that up with the real commitments internally is another question.
Absolutely. I think these are all really great points, and it looks like our audience agrees. We're getting a lot of love in the chat. David, I want to dive into a little bit of something that you touched on. 2023, and this has been underscoring our entire conversation today. In 2023, we saw some changes to DEIJ initiatives, including an increase in the backlash, and we've talked about that. How do you envision that landscape of DEIJ work evolving in 2024, considering both those ongoing challenges as well as these emerging opportunities for progress?
Absolutely. So, as has already been mentioned in this session, I think, it's really important to remember that attacks on DEI have existed forever. Anytime there's social justice, social progress, there's a backlash against it. So there is nothing new what we're seeing here. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because you wouldn't get a backlash unless you had made progress and you're starting to win on a lot of these fights and you're generating those kind of attacks. So I try to stay positive with some of these. Having said that, the last year's Supreme Court decision on affirmative action really has had a lot of ripple effects, because what was made clear in that decision, even though it was limited to admissions in higher education, right? What do universities like Harvard or UNC in that case do in terms of taking into account race when they're admitting students? I think a lot of the anti-DEI activists saw the writing on the wall with that decision about how the current conservative supermajority Supreme Court thinks about issues of race and race discrimination, and particularly applying what is sometimes called, which is the term I hate, a colorblind approach to race discrimination, meaning, discrimination against, majority groups, white individuals, members of dominant groups is, under the law just as bad as discrimination against, marginalized people. And that's kind of the attitude that the Supreme Court has sort of put forward in that case. And so that's, spurred a lot of anti-DEI lawsuits and attacks seeking to carry over that reasoning into the workplace context. So under the law, there's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the main statute prohibiting discrimination in employment. And then there's also Section 1981, which is a discrimination statute prohibiting race discrimination in contracting. And so there's a lot of activity and backlash aimed at applying that same colorblind mentality over in those statutes as well. And so where do I see that shaping things in 2024? Like, what do I think is going to happen within this field? Well, I think one thing that's going to happen is we're going to see a lot more universality in DEI programs. I've already seen that a lot. There were a few law firms that were sued last year for diversity fellowship programs that limited eligibility only to members of particular underrepresented groups in the legal profession. Each of those law firms had to open up their eligibility for those programs to say, well, now anyone can apply for our fellowship as long as they show that they have a demonstrated commitment to DEI issues. And then those lawsuits were dropped. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that going on with organizations where they say, okay, now everyone can participate. You could be an ally, you could be a member of a dominant majority group, you're allowed to access this opportunity or participate in this program. And we can talk later about the sort of pros and cons of that. Obviously, there's some dangers in that, but I think one of the more optimistic takes would be to say, I think it really does get back to that core belief that I certainly have as someone who works in this area, that a diverse, equitable, inclusive workplace really is better for everyone in the organization. And so having more people recognize that and sort of seeing how a workplace where everyone is respected, everyone feels welcome, everyone is able to contribute their best selves is something that even if you belong to a dominant or majority group identity, you're going to benefit from that kind of workplace environment. So that's just one trend that, I'm seeing is a kind of move toward more universal kind of frameworks for thinking about DEI. And then a second one would just be more of an emphasis on inclusive leadership capabilities, which is to say, I think what's going to happen with DEI is that in order to double down on this, we're going to say, okay, look, you're allowed to participate in these programs. We're going to expect you to show more competency on DEI. So we're going to expect you to be know how to be a better ally, to know how to communicate more effectively across difference within your organization, to know how to lead diverse teams, to know how to, engage in fair and transparent, recruitment practices and promotion practices. So I'm hoping that because it's much more legally safe, you can't sort of sue companies for sort of teaching people inclusive leadership skills. I'm hoping that we're going to see a bit of a shift in that direction as well.
Thank you, David, and thank you for walking us through that legal framework. It's really important that we have an understanding there. And I would say, that's something that I experience, all of the things you're highlighting and working with law firms, particularly in the DEI space. So I certainly agree with a lot of what you're saying. And I think those points are really spot on. I want to shift gears a little bit and really turn to Robin now. So the work of equity and inclusion at work is constantly evolving one, where you have to be proactive rather than reactive. What lessons have you all learned about practicing proactive rather than reactivity?
Thank you. Great question. The work is ever messy, ever changing, imperfect, right? It's humanity. So yes, it can invariably be more reactive than proactive. And I think in piggybacking off of what David was talking about, with the Supreme Court and what's happening externally, it feels like it's becoming a zero-sum game, and it shouldn't be. We all need to engage with DEI for collective learning, for collective growth. This is where the proactivity comes in. We need to do the work to gain greater understanding of how different populations experience the workplace, experience the environment. And of course, to the extent that populations are not treated well, then we're going to understand why. So that's really where the proactivity comes. I've learned that DEI work, when poorly executed, especially when we're reactive and trying to band-aid in any of the focus areas, can turn a significant, substantial amount of investment of time, resources, effort, and then have zero impact, or create negative impact and even harm. So DEI policies, training workshops, surveys, talks, right? So for example, we want to do a training program to address, to address this. But training programs, while great and helpful, educational, insightful, they raise awareness. Accountability changes the culture. So let's proactively work on accountability frameworks, on evaluation tools, on looking at the data, understand the root of the issue. I was in a previous organization that said, oh, let's provide meditation services, well-being meditation hour during lunch to address the symptoms of overwork, only to realize that no one attends it because they were busy and they were overworking. So the symptoms of the problem itself are preventing us from really implementing the right solutions. So for me, we need to change top down, bottom up, side to side, look at metrics. I'm really grounded on metrics, on data. Data serves a powerful tool. It's a grounding tool to bring people together and really see the reality. The kind of data that allows organizations to shift from inequity is just a word or it's really not happening, in our workplace, to inequity is a fact. Here are the metrics, here are the data, and then transform the conversation and actually working towards solving the problem versus, making various assumptions and denying that there's something wrong. So for me, the proactivity really comes from data and metrics, allowing us to quantify, even with the qualitative information, to truly what systemic inequity looks like in practice and to the extent that it actually exists.
Absolutely. And I think, you're spot on. I think we should all be leading with data, and we never really want to be in a space where we're being reactionary. We always want to make sure that to the best that we can, that we're being proactive in this space and in the work that we do. I also really like the point that you made about accountability. And I want to share that, I've done some work with some firms lately where I've seen this accountability piece be put into practice. I've seen some of the firms actually adopt competencies tied to inclusive leadership, tied to allyship, and actually use that in the feedback process so that they can hold their leaders accountable to these things. And I think that actually, we'll see how that plays out, but I think that's actually a really good framework, especially when we talk about holding people accountable. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in and build a little bit on what Robin said. All right, thank you. And I see the chat is still going, so it looks like we have our folks entertained. No matter the climate or time, organizations must always ensure that they are strengthening themselves. What steps can organizations take to embed principles of equity and justice into their core operations and culture to create more resilient and sustainable structures for advancing their DEIJ goals? And I'll start off with Leslie, and then we'll turn to Robin, and David, feel free to chime in as well.
I mean, as a recovering academic, I feel as though I could teach a whole class on what you just asked me for an entire semester, or maybe even put together a certification program. But I'll try to be succinct here. Definitely thinking about accountability, I think is huge, but also thinking through what accountability actually means. I think very often when people talk about accountability, they're talking about it in terms of something punitive, right? You know what I mean? It's like, I want to bust out a bucket of popcorn and watch as, watch as the punishment occurs, right? When I think if we're really, really, really serious about it, accountability actually at the end of the day is really about helping to ensure that the people within our organizations and also the people external to our organizations that we work with are actually all about a sense of responsibility, right? If I'm responsible for my job, right? If I am responsible for upholding the values of my organization, for example, right? Then chances are there will not have to be a need for an external form of accountability, right? And that means helping to ensure that everyone in our organization understands our mission, understands our theory of change, understands our organizational values, right? And, and these things are built into your weekly check-ins. They're built into your annual review process, right? But that also means, holding our external partners too, right? To like that same standard. This is who we are, right? And let's talk about what that means for how we work together, right? And so for me, I really just wanted to lean into accountability and how we frame it, because I think it's really, really important to, number one, both our cultures, our organizational cultures, which, you know what I mean? I know people throw this phrase around very loosely, but it is true. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? If you do not have the culture that is needed to like move forward a strategy, it's just not going to happen, or it's not going to happen the way that you want it to, right? And thinking through sort of like the structures, right, that help to undergird that culture, I think is really, really, really important. I think one more thing I want to say about this, since I'm taking this whole structure thing really literally, I remember when I pivoted from being an academic to being a practitioner, I would hear all the time, we are building the plane while we're flying it, right? I certainly hope that most of us aren't still in the process of starting to build those planes, right? I hope that what we're doing in terms of structures right now, I hope that this is where many of us are. And if not, I hope that we collectively can support each other in this endeavor, because this is a movement after all. At this point, we should be checking to make sure that the doors aren't going to fly off the plane, right? It might be too soon to make that analogy, but yeah, like we should be at a place where we have been experimenting, right? We've been seeing what works and what doesn't, right? And we are building on that success, and we are talking to each other and learning from each other. And we're also learning from our staff internally, and we are learning from our external partners. So, I don't know if that's a satisfying response, but
I think those are great points. Robin?
Oh, I love everything that Leslie said, plus 10,000. I also appreciated what you said, Leslie, about accountability. It's very akin to transparency, how loose that word is always, in organizations. Oh, you need to be more transparent, then I'll trust you. The difficult part of transparency is actually it doesn't always lead to trust. It leads to further surveillance. Right? I don't trust, that you know what you're doing, or I don't trust the experts, or I know better than you. And so I really hope people are more humble in thinking that, what transparency truly means. And it isn't about just building trust, but it is about surveillance as well. And that is a negative effect of that. For me, I tell leaders and organizations to really first understand, to create equity, justice, inclusion, we really need to understand fully the process of exclusion, because then we'll never really truly grapple with what the reality is and what's happening. I think we can also exist for a very long time with an organic approach of implied values and practices. But eventually, as the workforce changes, demographics, right? We have 5 generations in the workforce right now. If nothing is concrete, defined, what are we holding ourselves to, right? Values that are on a wall, assumptions of policies and practices. And so we really have to be clear. I think what people need is more clarity than transparency, actually. We need to weave a common language, a common alignment into the fabric of the organizational culture. I'm not quite a fan of just a standalone DEI strategy out there in the ether. It needs to start with our institutional identity, a strong, clear set of values, behaviors, expectations, weave that into the entire organizational culture, practice, fabric. So we know that we're actually doing the work and living the work. One thing that NRDC is also doing is really embedding equity practitioners into our operating structure as well. So it doesn't also fall on just the Office of DEI on a specific department or function.
Yeah, thank you for really important. And thank you for those practical tips. I love that you said that, implementing equity partners across, the organization as opposed to having it housed in one department. I think if we all, at whatever title we held, really looked at things through an equity-based lens, we'd be a lot closer to accomplishing our DEIJ goals. I think this next question really is a great question to ask you, David. There's no denying that national and state legislators will play a huge role in how the DEIJ landscape changes in the coming months, especially with the already growing number of lawsuits that you mentioned earlier being brought against DEI programs. What role do legislative and policy changes play in either protecting or threatening DEIJ efforts? And how can advocates effectively engage in policy and advocacy to advance equity and justice?
Yeah, it's a great and very important question right now. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of the effects of these lawsuits because just by bringing the lawsuits, even though many of them are still working their way through the courts and haven't achieved a final resolution, it creates a chilling effect where organizations are then afraid to do anything bold on DEI. They're putting their heads down. They don't want to attract attention to themselves because they don't want to get sued, even if they think they might ultimately win the lawsuit. So that is something I worry about a lot. I mentioned the sort of quiet quitting phenomenon. I think a lot of those are the efforts that a lot of the kind of legislative and, lawsuit attacks on DEI are having right now. I think it's also sadly is going to change some of the legal frameworks for thinking about DEI because we are dealing with a conservative supermajority Supreme Court. So even though they haven't rendered a decision under those two laws that I just mentioned recently around Title VII or Section 1981, I do think it's only a matter of time before some of these lawsuits that are kind of happening, bubbling around in the lower courts make their way up to the Supreme Court and we get another potentially horrendous decision from this court that has issued so many such horrendous decisions over the previous years. So I think we have to take those threats very seriously. But in terms of how we respond, I think one thing that's really important is to coordinate across sectors. I think what the anti-DEI movement has done really well is having a multi-pronged attack. They've got a media strategy for the sort of court of public opinion. They've got a litigation strategy. They've got a judicial appointment strategy to get judges who are aligned with their ideologies sort of through the court system. They're thinking about how academia and government and, all of this can kind of combine into this broader movement against DEI. I think it's going to be really important for people who work in their particular field, whether it is in academia, the nonprofit sector, the corporate sector, whatever. How can we coordinate with each other on the pro-DEI side in order to make sure that we're effectively countering these attacks, not just in a courtroom setting or a legislative setting, but more broadly? And connected to that, I think, is really thinking about how to win the narrative war. Law is just so much a reflection of culture. And I think, what the other side has done very effectively, I think, is one is to rebrand, also to brand DEI as a kind of elitist sort of project. So I think they do a lot of work trying to portray DEI as something that's not relevant to sort of ordinary working people, but that's only something that you care about if you are some, educated elite on some, fancy college somewhere. I think what we need to do on the pro-DEI side is really emphasize how powerful DEI is for, ordinary working people just to have a fair shot at, getting a job, a fair shot at being treated with dignity and respect in their workplaces, at, getting access to equal opportunity, being able to get promoted, all of that kind of thing, right? So that ordinary people really feel a connection between this work and their lived experience. And then I think also exposing the other side for their own extremism. I think the other side has done a very good job of portraying itself as, well, we're all about, equality and we're all about just treating people equally. But as we've seen with some of the exposés, there was a New York Times expose on the anti-DEI movement, recently. If you have access to their private emails and correspondence that they're sending each other, their actual views on these issues are not about let's just treat everyone fairly and equally. It's really quite racist, misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic, etc. And so I think more of that, of exposing the other side, and their extremism, and then working really hard on our side to win that narrative war. Because I think if you win the narrative war and more people are with you on the underlying values and the importance of DEI, then the law kind of follows on from the culture in many ways.
Absolutely. And I think, you raise a really interesting point around these coordinated attacks, because that's what they are, right? And I really like the idea and the your point around working together and collaborating, because I think it's so easy to believe that these aren't coordinated attacks, but they are. They're coordinated attacks that have a very distinct strategy. So understanding that, I think, is crucial, right? To making sure that we're prepared to go against the opposition. I'm going to change gears a little bit and focus a little bit about DEI in the workplace. So critics of these initiatives in the workplace argue that it is ineffective, right? That they're ineffective and that it does the opposite of what it intends. How have you seen those DEIJ initiatives have positive impacts on employees and build strong organizational structures? And what changes in metrics within your organization, or just in the movement generally, have you seen when implementing DEIJ initiatives? And we can start with Robin and then Leslie, if you don't mind.
Sure. I've shared this before. I think it's difficult for a company to improve on any DEI efforts if we don't know where we're starting or what we're working toward. I think it was Peter Drucker who said, measure what matters. We cannot improve what we don't measure. And so while annual DEI surveys, employee engagement surveys are great, we really need to remain nimble and both reactive and proactive to the changing needs that happen externally, internally. So we've got to be more rigid and diligent about our metrics. We need metrics focused on the employee experience. We need metrics focused on leadership competencies, as you say. We need metrics focused on accessibility. We need metrics focused on the entire employee cycle, retention, tenure, departures, right? Acceptance rates. Are we attracting diverse candidates into the hiring pipeline, but then we're still finding teams homogenous? That's a sign that some bias could be cropping up in the hiring process. So how are our rubrics? How are our frameworks being used? We've got members of organizations that can be relatively diverse, but we notice participations in ERGs are very low, employee resource groups. So the number could represent a deeper cultural problem. So we have got to be much more proactive, everything, promotion, advancement rates, professional development, really establishing what outcomes an institution is striving for and then gauging the process and the progress towards those outcomes. So outcomes, not intentions. And really we've gone beyond that in our institution into really looking at well-being. What are the resources and systems that enable health, safety, thriving? Are our healthcare benefits inclusive for neurodiverse people, disabled people, working parents, queer and trans people, so on? So, do people feel empowered to take sick leave? So those are the things that we've been tracking, and like I've said throughout this time, metrics and data are really powerful tools and need to be looked at and adjusted and adapted.
Thank you for that. And I know, Dr. Hinkson, you have some good points on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like plus 1 to 1,000, Robin. But I think I want to focus a little bit more just on the critics of this work, right? It's been my observation, and whatever. I mean, in my previous life, I was actually part of some of this, sort of data collection efforts, right? And to the critics who say, for example, training doesn't work, right? And in particular, mandatory training around this doesn't work. I will say yes, and, right? Because number one, right? Number one, not every organization who says that they're committed to doing this work is actually committed to a change in business as usual, right? And so having a training and it's one and done and we do it once a year, ta-da, right? That's not going to change anything. That's not going to change anything. That's number one. So if you have organizations that are having these trainings and they don't have an actual commitment to this work, it's obviously not going to, it's actually not going to work, right? And then also number two, there is so much focus on the what. And I think part of that is because so many of these studies, although not all of them, are highly quantitative, right? In their nature, there isn't much focus on the how, right? How are you doing this work, right? I think trainings and workshops are amazing for number one, getting clarity on what a thing is and what it means, right? And also alignment around that, right? So for example, if you have organizational values and you haven't had org-wide conversations about what each of those values mean, you're not going to get alignment. It's not going to work, right? And then also there need to be opportunities for people to actually practice, right? Practice. So we got a training and a workshop, right?
Yes.
And then you're like, okay, so what are the tools and resources that we can provide you with so that you can make sure that you're actually embedding this into your work, into your practices, right? And so I think that's the thing. We just need to be more intentional. We have to be intentional about what we're doing. And then finally, the work that this work needs to be grounded, not just in previous research around this, but a lot of this work is fairly ahistorical and fairly atheoretical, right? And especially now, like I would say, like we've had a couple of generations in which, you know what I mean, social studies / history in public school curricula have been like, sorry, we don't have time for it because we need to get these reading and math scores up, right? And as a result, right, we are seeing the results of this, right? Not just in our workplace, right, but on social media, right? And in a host of other places, right? I actually think that this work, when done really well, it's like you offer learning opportunities for everyone to learn together, right? That actually help to connect the dots for the why we're doing this, and also help us think through how we do this in a way that is actually effective and actually designed to actually help support our missions. So.
Oh, can I
Thank
just say something? Oh, Leslie, you're so spot on. The instant gratification world that we're in is that's the critics also of DEI, right? There is no get equitable, get inclusive quick. So the one-off workshops, we need them redeployed as part of a much larger comprehensive change-making effort to get it to stick. We can't have serial, disjointed, they need to be interconnected and a cumulative set of interventions. Otherwise, we're not building change, it's not sticking. And then the critics come. So just music to my ears on application and learning.
Absolutely. And I particularly like leaning into those adult learning principles and really focusing on giving these things practice, right? So I really appreciate that. I see we're coming short on time, and I want to make sure we give space for the audience to ask questions. So I will ask one final question that we have prepared. And this question is for all panelists. And since we've heard from Robin and Leslie, maybe we start with David. Even though things are hard right now, we have a whole movement of people, and I can see this from the chat today, right? Of people working together to create something bigger and longer lasting than ourselves. What brings you hope and optimism about this work?
Well, you just said it, Ivelisse, which is the whole movement of people who are committed to bringing a change in this world, which is, sometimes with respect to things like all of these legal attacks on DEI, in our center at NYU, we often think of this as a little bit like the irresistible force meeting the immovable object, which is that the Supreme Court and the irresistible force of the law is like attacking what is actually an immovable object. So Justice Sotomayor said it in her dissent in the affirmative action case, where she said, notwithstanding this court's actions, society's progress toward equality cannot be permanently halted. Diversity is now a fundamental American value housed in our varied and multicultural American community that only continues to grow. The pursuit of racial diversity will go on. And she's absolutely right about that. You know, like people can keep attacking it, you know, all they want. And unfortunately, I think they are going to have some victories along the way. But we've been here before. And the thing that gives me hope is knowing that there is such a powerful, huge community of people out there, including many people on this call today, who are really committed to making sure that the pursuit of racial diversity and a pluralistic, democratic, open, inclusive society comes to fruition.
I mean,
Thank you. I don't know.
I can jump in. You know, 100% what David just said. Like if I don't believe we are a movement, then I just can't keep doing this, right? So I just keep assuming that we are a movement that is growing and will just continue to get stronger. And the other thing, it's like, you know, just thinking about my kids, right? You know, I remember when I went to undergrad, right? When I went to undergrad, and the way that this all unfolded was like diversity. Like I remember the then president at that point in time, his speech, you know, basically going on about how the institution was going through the birthing pains of diversity. And I was like, number one, who's giving birth? And number two, who's experiencing the pain, right? And I found that a lot of what was going on there is, you know, I show up, I mean, I'm a Brooklyn girl and I show up in the middle of nowhere, Massachusetts, right? And it is assumed that I am going to be doing this work, right? It is assumed that when I go up to the keg and ask for a beer, that I need to actually hear about how much someone hates racism. Why are you asking me that question, right? Right? However many years later, my oldest daughter attends this same institution, right? And it's not perfect, not perfect to say the least, but the changes that I have seen since I was there, right? That gives me hope, and we just keep building.
What brings me hope is it is a movement. It is collective community. I am seeing people now from underrepresented groups increasingly join the workforce. So I don't feel alone anymore in the hopes of creating and cultivating a workforce that thrives, you know, with marginalized communities and those that I share. So I'm seeing many who have not faltered in the work despite it being difficult. I'm seeing pockets of DEI where the issues are no longer considered difficult conversations or conversations to be avoided. It's becoming essential conversation across all levels every day, even starting with my own executive leadership team. So we need everyone. We need people who say, let's burn it all down. Those that say, okay, incremental change and baby steps along the way, right? So side to side, top down, bottom up. I don't think any movement is going to be successful without this. We know marginalization is built into the core institutions of society, everything, finance, education, healthcare, right? All of it. And so I share in and grounded in the vision of Bell Hooks. I want there to be a place in which the world is a place where we can see each other's differences in a way that is redemptive, in a way that is full of hope and possibility.
Absolutely. And I think for me, I love a lot of what you've all said today. As a kid, I think, and as a younger adult, before coming into the DEI space, before really coming into myself, I'd always see those lines, right? That it's all interconnected and that it exists at, oppression and all these things exists at every level, right? And I would think to myself, well, maybe I'm just seeing things, right? Maybe I'm just picking at things. And it's really great for me to be in this space now and see that we can all see the same things. I think back when I was younger, I thought to myself, I feel so lonely in viewing the world this way. And now having this community of people who also view the world this way and being here with you folks and hearing your process through these questions and the things that you're working on, to me, that gives me hope, right? That we're not in this alone. And I think the other side does a really good job of making us feel like we're alone and that, the things that we're seeing don't actually exist and the gaslighting is real. But being here with all of you, I think is something that for me certainly gives me a lot of hope. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and get to some of these really great questions that have been coming in through this entire presentation, to the chat. So the first question that I'm going to touch on, which is a question we actually had prepared, but we didn't really get to because of time. How can we ask funders to hold themselves accountable in their funding allocations? And I know we had, I think Robin and Leslie teed up to kind of give their input on this.
I mean, I can start. I think there are a couple of things, right? Especially in this moment where funders we're already kind of like, we're not sure we can get down with this 100%, but it looks like people are doing it, right? You know what I mean? And then also funders who are like, well, we wanted to, but now things are scary, right? I actually think a brilliant way to think about how you can still support this work moving forward, right? Without having to name the thing because you're afraid is, let's have some more organizational capacity grants, right? Because at the end of the day, so much of DEI is about funding for organizational capacity, right? Capacity to learn, capacity to practice, right? Capacity in terms of being able to revise, right? And actually add to our existing policies and procedures. So I would say, hey, let's have some more organizational capacity money, folks. And I think the second thing that I would say is, is for funders to actually for themselves do a little bit of learning, right? And I'm not talking about yourself and your deep rooted biases or whatever. You know what I mean? You can do that on your own time, right? What I think funders hopefully would set aside a little bit more time to do is like really, really cultivate a deeper understanding of how diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and particularly in my organization, racial justice and equity, because like so much of what we do internally, so that work that the programming that we do, right, is actually centering these issues, right? If they would have a deeper understanding of those connections and how, like, being able to build those muscles, like, throughout the organization, like I like to think about DEIJ and the like as sort of like not the cinnamon that people talk about, but like the egg in a cake, right? Or whatever binding agent you use, right? It's a binding agent. It holds everything that we do together. So funders could actually just do a little bit more work or ask a few more questions about why this is integral to us being able to actually like meet our missions, meet our goals. Those are the two particular things I'd love to see more of in funders.
I came from the foundation world, and I saw then that we were making great strides in the understanding of structural racism and grant making that's really focused on achieving racial justice. And so when I was at Human Rights, we had really good frameworks and checkpoints in our grants process. Same when I was at Wikipedia, we even implemented the equity fund there. So to me, I think what's important for funders and foundations is to really deepen their defense of equity in light of what David shared about the Supreme Court, and just like people are becoming scared and risk averse. Remain committed to explicitly supporting underrepresented racial groups. To what Leslie pointed out, we focus more on capacity building. So capacity building was really the focus where we felt we could really empower and influence. So ground yourselves in your values, and that supporting people of color in the pursuit of freedom remains a priority. So despite what the Supreme Court says, I think I was reading about in a philanthropy paper about the stepping back from a lot from what happened at the Supreme Court. But let's bear in mind, addressing racial discrimination still remains legal. Collecting racial data remains legal. Funding nonprofits that work with people of color remains legal. Building power for communities of color through civic action is more important than ever and is legal. So let's not forget kind of the bigger, more holistic progress that we need to make. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we've had a lot of talk about data collection. And I think, we've made a lot of really good points about why data is important. One of the questions that came in around this asks, how do you balance gathering internal data with creating a space where employees feels comfortable sharing their experiences?
I can speak to that from what we're seeing right now. We have started to move away from kind of EEOC data, endeavor, and it has been difficult, right? It has been hard. We've been pushing for more transparency on that and category, be able to capture, because it's important for us to really know where we are, the realities, and what we can work with. We share why, we share what it's used for, we share the outcomes, we share our initiatives tied to that, and hope through those encouragements it can happen.
I love that, being clear about, why we're asking for that information. Anyone else want to chime in here? Well, we have one final question, I guess, for David. How much can the law really follow culture when we have our current Supreme Court and no retirement requirements? Or were you thinking more legislatively and less the courts?
Yes, well, as Leslie said earlier about doing a semester-long program, I feel like I could talk for a whole semester about the relationship between law and culture. There have been whole books, written on this subject alone, but just to sort of very much shorthand it, I think that it's very much symbiotic and they influence one another, right? So I don't think it's all, what unidirectional of culture directly influencing law. And you're absolutely right. The Supreme Court, I think, is a disaster. It's a 6-3 conservative supermajority. It's going to remain very conservative for quite a long time. So any cases that work their way up to the Supreme Court, we all have to brace ourselves for a lot of bad decisions. However, I even think in that context, though, there's a difference between bad, very bad, and like catastrophically bad, right? So there are, cultural trends that can actually steer things away from the catastrophically bad. Because when things go to the Supreme Court, they're still going to have a decision to make about, do we go scorched earth and sort of make all sort of DEI programming illegal? Or do we sort of give organizations more discretion to do these kinds of activities? So a good example would be, there was a decision in 2020 called the Bostock decision, which found that sex discrimination under Title VII includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It was a huge win for the LGBTQ+ community. And the author of that decision was Justice Neil Gorsuch, an ultra-conservative member of the court who authored this pro-LGBTQ decision. Now, so I think there are instances like that where the sort of cultural conversations around inclusion and acceptance and promotion of, LGBTQ, inclusion issues can still sort of influence even at the Supreme Court level, but certainly, state courts, and other kind of lower courts and other sort of legal changes can occur as well.
Can I add to that as well? Right. I mean, I know that so much of why we're here today is because of that affirmative action ruling, right? And I would actually really like us all to think about this as an opportunity to actually rethink the way that affirmative action was actually practiced. And quiet as it's kept, every single college and university has a different way that they actually approach affirmative action, right? And so the idea that taking 2 universities, looking at the way they do business, supposedly, and then saying, well, that's it, we got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm saying, let's rebuild. Like we need to rebuild, right? And that is a big part of the work that we are doing here. And so I actually, in some ways, find that ruling I'm thinking about it as an opportunity, leaning into radical optimism and thinking about how do we do this better?
Thank you. And we're at time, so I'm going to wrap us up. And I want to say thank you to all of you. It has been fantastic. And I will read something someone put in the chat that I thought was great, but also thank you to Green 2.0 and the folks that worked really hard to organize this. This has been a fantastic event. And I will end by reading something that someone put in the chat that I have to echo. This is absolutely wonderful. Thank you for championing the work. This fed my soul, and it's an inspiration to keep doing the good work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.